More evidence is coming out of the IgG4 antibody formations in the mRNA vaccinated. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And there's a new important information that became available from yet another peer-reviewed publication on this topic. Now, I'm going to start with conclusions and summary first, but before I go there, I wanted to let you know, listen, these videos are made with the assumption that you would have seen the other prior videos in the series. So that's what you would need to see to get the proper background. And I made a number of these videos, so let me just recount that. The very first video was about the first paper on this topic that I've noticed. It was preceded by another paper that at the time I wasn't aware of. Second video talked about the second publication and that data, plus a review that finally started to investigate what is going on in the mRNA vaccinated people with regards to these IgG4 antibodies. Now, the third video was dedicated to the topic on why this might be happening. Fourth video, one of the more important ones, talked about how the mRNA vaccinated individuals could be protecting themselves. This is one of the big areas of interest for me because the group of scientists that I discussed this with believe this might not be trivial, and we should be paying attention to this with great detail. And I'll tell you right away as to why. And then the fifth and sixth videos in the series, they're simply recounting more published evidence. This is now the seventh video talking about fifth paper now that has come out in support of this evidence, and I can tell you that there is one more when it's going to get even more complicated. So there's one more paper, so another video is going to be released. So that's at least the background. So now let's just talk about super briefly about IgG4. So what are these? These are somewhat mysterious antibodies, but when you think of IgG4 antibodies, you can think of maybe three areas that at least I can think of based on what I've been studied in literature on this topic. Number one, it might have protective role against allergens. So the good example of that you can think of is a beekeeper that will produce these antibodies so that they don't have to experience pain when they get stung, okay? But they also have pathogenic role, and this is where we know a lot more about these antibodies from that area, and hence they are involved in immune conditions. And generally, you could think of autoimmune diseases, and the other area of pathologies that these antibodies are also involved in cancer. And this is the reason why we're studying this in such great detail, and why I think this should get as much attention as possible, so that the vast majority of people who have taken the mRNA vaccine can be monitored and protected if need be. We just still don't know what it means, but that's an area why we're so focused. And we will be making another video just on the topic of cancer and how the IgG4s are involved in cancer development, okay, and why they might be helping cancer development. So stay tuned for that. Oh, by the way, my name is Dr. Mikola Rashek of Genomics. All right, let's start with this particular paper. Let me give you the summary. What did this paper actually add to? So it confirmed some of the observations we've already seen. That's important, and it added some new elements. So number one, it confirmed that this is basically seen only in mRNA vaccinated individuals. So it did confirm that if you took the virus vector vaccine, such as AstraZeneca, and this is exactly what the authors studied in this publication, then you were protected. We're going to discuss a little bit more on that as well. So another protection, so this is not seen in all mRNA vaccinated individuals. There's certain events that might protect you from developing these IgG4 antibodies. And this is what they confirmed again. If you were infected first and then you were vaccinated with mRNA vaccines, you appear to be protected. At least that's what all the studies show thus far. All right. Then what else it confirmed? It confirmed some sad news. One of them was that if you never were infected and you had just 2 shots, you could be developing IgG4 antibodies if enough time elapses beyond the second shot. And then if you had a third shot, so 2 mRNA vaccines, and they studied specifically Pfizer in this particular paper, Pfizer vaccines, and then you had a booster, so 3 shots in total, there appears to be an observed increase in IgG4 antibodies. And then if you were infected, whether you had 2 shots or 3 shots, so if you had a breakthrough infection after your vaccinations, not before but after, that can also act as if it was a booster, and it can contribute towards IgG4 antibodies. So this is what we've already known from prior literature, so it confirms these findings. Where it provided very valuable information is that it provided once more information on the Fc portion function of the antibodies being compromised. Now, what is that? Remember, antibodies, they have like a Y shape, right? So the tips of the letter Y, that's what those tips will be attacking the elements we want to get rid of with the use of antibodies, like a pathogen. So whatever antibodies are attacking, that's called an antigen. So obviously spike protein is an antigen. We produce antibodies against the spike protein. It's the tips of that letter Y that will bind to the spike protein, all right? But then you have that stalk underneath, right? That's called Fc portion, Fc component, and that's very, very important. It's through recognition of the stalk that's how immune cells eliminate the pathogen that is bound by antibodies. Because if antibodies bind to the pathogen, okay, great, you prevent the pathogen from interacting with maybe the receptors, but what else is happening? You need to get rid of it. And this is what happens. Immune cells come in, they grab the stalk portion, and then they can swallow up the entire complex and destroy it. Now that can be compromised. And this is the second now paper that showed that this is what is affected in the mRNA vaccinated individuals who have an increase of these IgG4 antibodies. And we'll talk about this in a moment. This is crucial because this is where we're gaining information as to why these antibodies potentially could be dangerous for cancer development. We don't know. This is a theory, but this is exactly what we need to be investigating, and I'm obviously hoping scientists will be jumping on this quickly. And hopefully it's all fine, but there is some negative evidence here. So they did study that, and then the new information that they provided was, number one, was that they showed these IgG4 antibodies not just in blood, which is where they were studied in all other papers, but they also studied mucosal fluids. So that included your saliva and your tears, right? So they were confirming these results are also present in those fluids as well. And then finally, they also give us some clues. What happens to those individuals who already took 2 AstraZeneca vaccines and then had mRNA booster, and subsequently, so what happens then, and subsequently were infected as well? What happens then? And we're gaining more information on that. Now, the final conclusion of these authors was that, listen, boosters are likely going to increase these IgG4 antibodies. That's conclusion number one. And this is the first paper of all of this literature that I've studied so far that clearly stated that perhaps what we need to do is reduce the amount of vaccine so that it presents less antigen. So we basically need, what the likely solution is for the future vaccines is that we should be reducing the amount of antigen. So in this case, of course, we should be reducing the amount of genetic material, the mRNAs, that result in the production of the spike protein. So first clear suggestion as to how the vaccine makers should be resolving this issue for the future boosters. All right, so hopefully we're going to have more science on this, but I thought that was very interesting. All right, so then let's talk about this. It was really interesting what these authors did. They compared people who were infected first and then took Pfizer shots versus those who were not infected at all and took Pfizer shots, and they contrasted that those who took the AstraZeneca shots, okay? And they compared them by antigen exposure. So whether you are infected or you took the vaccine, that counts as an antigen exposure because spike protein was presented to your body, to your immune system. So right away, they were able to say that two antigen exposures were already different if you were infected first versus vaccinated, meaning a person who was infected and then took one Pfizer shot only versus those people who had two Pfizer shots. Right away, there was already observed differences in the response of the immune system. One of the big ones, to the benefit of those who were infected first, was that they were producing more IgA antibodies in their saliva. That's very good. Those are good antibodies. And these antibodies were targeting a variety of different variants quite effectively, which is not what can be said against the IgG type of antibodies that are typically found in the blood. And we're gonna go into this. But what we're more interested in is what happens after 3 antigen exposures. This is what they studied. So those who were infected once and then had 2 Pfizer shots versus those who had 3 Pfizer shots, okay? And what they were showing is that there's definitely, again, still continued differences in the immune response. And this is what they were. Now, unfortunately, those who were infected first and had then 2 mRNA shots, their IgA antibodies in their saliva started to go down. That's unfortunate because you want those antibodies because they are the ones that are effective in those mucosal fluids. However, the good news is that their overall IgG antibodies were doing better than those who were just took the three shots, and especially that was definitely observed with increased function of IgG1. So this was similar results between blood and saliva. The other big one is that the recognition of that Fc stock of the antibodies was reduced in those who took 3 shots as opposed to those who were infected first and had 2 shots. Again, remember, this is really important. So there's receptors on immune cells called Fc gamma R, and there's a couple of different types. There's multiple different types. They tested two different types, and these receptors were no longer recognizing to the same degree the antibodies produced post 3 mRNA shots as opposed to those who were infected first and had mRNA shots. So that ability to recognize the stock is compromised. So that's really important. And on top of that, the most important, the biggest difference is, of course, that what was observed is that those who had 3 mRNA Pfizer shots, they produce IgG4 antibodies versus those who were infected first did not. And that's the big one right there as well. Now, the one that is probably the most important news out of this paper is that what the authors mentioned is that there was a correlation between the increase of IgG4 antibodies in the triple vaccinated, mRNA vaccinated individuals and the reduction in recognition of these stocks of antibodies, those Fc components by the receptors that are supposed to be binding it. So there's a correlation. Basically, the more IgG4s you had, the fewer of those stocks were recognized. And that's why this is most important news, in my opinion, is because that's exactly how IgG4s can contribute towards cancer development because their stalks are not meant to be recognized by immune cells. And this is why IgG4s can act like a cloaking mechanism to hide something from the immune system. But as a consequence, you now have an increasing amount of stalks, antibody stalks, FC stalks, that will not be recognized by immune system and remove it. And it can compete with proper behavior of antibodies that are supposed to be cleaning out cancers in our body. So we're going to be talking about that in a future video, but to me this is very important finding that should be studied in greater detail moving forward as well. Now the good news is that this correlation was only observed in the blood and not in saliva. The bad news is that it was observed in the blood, and blood of course distributes these antibodies to the entire body, right? So it means that this competition for these stocks by our immune system is now potentially affected anywhere. All right, so that basically summarizes what they were observing. Oh, another thing that I can mention is that the typical responses post these boosters, post vaccinations, are especially designated towards the ancestral strain, so the one that started the pandemic, which of course isn't around. Even so, they were testing spike proteins of different variants all the way up to Omicron, early versions of Omicron, which are also mostly gone. Omicron is continuously evolving, and unfortunately, basically, the further away you're getting from the ancestral strain, the fewer antibodies are being produced that can recognize these variants, and fewer recognition of these stocks, FC stocks of antibodies are observed. There's only one glimmer of hope in all of this, is that antibodies after 3 injections of mRNA did better in terms of recognizing BA2 variant of Omicron as opposed to BA1 variant of Omicron. And BA2 came after BA1. And the reason why that might be good news is that perhaps eventually multiple Omicron exposures maybe are finally shifting our ability from producing antibodies not just against the ancestral strain, but perhaps now the body's finally shifting towards producing antibodies that might be recognizing some of the later strains of of the virus. All right, but overall, both the neutralization is reduced as well as recognition of these FC components. Now let's talk about the AstraZeneca, because where there is a value here is that they took individuals who had 2 AstraZeneca shots and then they had an mRNA booster. And the good news here is that the majority of these people, they were protected. They do not produce IgG4 antibodies. Few individuals had slightly elevated IgG4 amounts, but overall that was dramatically lower than what is observed if you just had the mRNA shots. So that's good news. Now let's talk about what happens with breakthrough infection. So this is when you're vaccinated and you get infected afterwards. Very common these days, right? So what they did is they took individuals who never been infected and been vaccinated. And they looked at individuals who had 2 mRNA shots and then they were infected by Delta, versus individuals who had 3 mRNA shots and then they were infected with the Omicron, okay? And basically what the outcome is that yes, IgG4 antibodies are produced so that the infection acts almost basically like another booster. So they only looked at post 1 infection. We don't know whether numerous infections keep doing this. Would be very valuable information to know, although perhaps numerous infection might change what kind of antibodies are being built and might fix that issue. Perhaps, we don't know. We need more science now. But if you were infected, then you seem to be producing IgG4 antibodies after your vaccination. So it acts like an additional booster. The issue is that those who had 3 shots and were infected with Omicron, they had lower responses against recognizing those stocks of the antibodies than those who were infected with Delta. But what I thought was even more valuable is what happens with individuals who had 2 AstraZeneca shots, followed by mRNA booster, followed by infection. Because now you have 4 antigen exposure there. And basically, the take-home message is that those who had 2 AstraZeneca shots, mRNA booster, and they got infected, they also had a slight increased risk of those IgG4 antibodies as well, that were directed against the ancestral strain, so the wild type, the one that started the pandemic that is now all gone. But it's not what variant the spike protein the antibodies recognize, it's whether they're IgG4 or not, because those are the antibodies that could be now competing with proper function of the antibodies in our body that are supposed to be fighting cancer development, right? So the take-home message with that is that if you took AstraZeneca and you had an mRNA booster, well, subsequent infection could still enhance the level of IgG4 and increases the risk further. But overall, AstraZeneca protects you well. If you did not mix, then you should be okay. And we did know from previous literature as well that I discussed in previous video that if you had a combo where you just took 1 AstraZeneca and then mRNA, you also had an increased risk of IgG4 antibodies. So basically, this is why the evidence is now stacking that this appears to be mRNA vaccine generated, most likely because too much antigen was being presented to the immune system, so much so that the immune system started responding in a way to produce IgG4 antibodies to start cloaking the antigen away from the immune system. So that's basically what we're getting. Now, to conclude, what does this mean moving forward? Obviously, we need to be collecting more evidence, and I really hope that we'll be studying this quick. But to me, medical doctors, likely should be paying close attention to both the infection and vaccine history of their patients, and if the patients were mRNA vaccinated without prior infection before vaccination, it might not be perhaps a bad idea to have their IgG4 antibodies checked, just to see, well, because otherwise, remember, we see these IgG4 antibodies in certain related diseases, right? So then at least such a patient could be sent to professionals and then dealt with the way we are already dealing with such individuals medically, right? And then if you're a private individual, not in a medical field, well, don't expect your doctor to know anything about this at the moment. This is still flying under the radar because this is really just an emerging information. All of this information came out within last year. And in total, as I mentioned, we have 7 publications at the moment, 6 showing data in humans and 1 in animals, right? So this is still fairly new. But if, again, you were mRNA vaccinated and you were not infected first, you might consider checking your own IgG4 antibodies on your own, okay? And just to see, because if they are elevated, then again, we already know what to do in such context because there are IgG4 related diseases that are being treated in medicine, right? So then the point is that it might appear that those who took the mRNA shots might be predisposed to certain conditions that might need attention. We don't know this yet, but clearly there's evidence that we should be paying attention. All right, that's all I have for you right now. But as I mentioned, there will be another video on another paper, the 6th one, And that one is going to be complicated because it adds to another theory how else IgG4 antibodies could be adding to the overall complexity of medical complexity. So that one will be really complicated video. Stay tuned for that. And then another one in the making is how IgG4s could be contributing towards cancer development. And the group of authors that I have the privilege of being involved with, we're currently writing another review just on that very topic for publications, just because we want this information out as fast as possible so that the community can be alerted, because we think perhaps solutions are not challenging and we need to make sure no one is harmed. All right, thank you everyone. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for your support. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please share this video. You know, this is how we grow. Please leave your comments and stay tuned for more science. This is by far the greatest topic of my interest at the moment. It has hijacked me away a bit from studying another really interesting topic, which is basically how the vagus nerve might be affected by the spike protein. There's more to come out on this topic as well. But yeah, stay tuned, all right? And I'll see you next time. And as always, consider being outdoors as much as possible. You know what? That reminds me, you know those FC stocks of antibodies that I talked about? Well, talking about complexity, they not only do they have specific structure to be recognized by receptors, they can also be decorated with sugars in different manners. And this is how your lifestyle could actually influence what these stocks look like. And depending, for example, on your diet, you could be decorating those antibody stocks, those FC stocks, with different types of sugars, right? So if you always wondered how does lifestyle influence your immune system, there's many different ways. That's where I think having quality diet and exercising can really positively impact your immune system. That's just one example. You can literally influence what type of sugars are attached to those stocks, and they can influence how effectively those receptors on the immune systems recognize those stocks. So you can influence how well things are being degraded by the immune system through your quality, healthy lifestyle. So stay active, go outside, go outdoors, and watch your diet. That's not much we can do right now, really, right? Except protecting our immune systems through always improving our quality of life and healthy lifestyle. All right, that's it. Bye, everyone.